In the gentle, humid night of Mesopotamia, where the wind glides past as if whispering a memory too ancient to name, you can almost feel time pause for a moment, as though it's waiting for someone to listen to a story it refuses to let fade. From that quiet stretch of earth, the first kings of humanity emerged, Alulim and Alalnga, with reigns that reached beyond all earthly limits. Enme-Barajesi, the first ruler confirmed by archaeology, Lugalbanda, half history and half legend. Gilgamesh, confronting the fear of death as humanity's oldest question, and Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, who built the earliest systems of law and governance. They did more than rule, they shaped the way humans first understood power, memory, and their own fragility. And as the night settles softly over the two rivers like a thin veil drawn across the past, the story of these ancient kings begins to unfold, gently guiding the listener forward with bedtime history. In the dim, quiet space where the two great rivers meet, the people of Sumer began imagining a kind of order far larger than themselves, long before writing ever came into existence. The world around them was too vast, too unpredictable, and every force of nature carried a power far beyond human control. Rain could nourish the fields, but it could also sweep away an entire way of life in a single night. The rivers could bring rich, fertile silt, but they could just as easily shift their course without warning and erase a village as if it had never been there at all. Faced with such fragility, they believed that true authority had to come from somewhere higher, from a source that exceeded humanity. That belief was not mere superstition. It was the way the Sumerians made sense of existence. If there was a force strong enough to keep the harvest from failing, wise enough to divide water fairly, and steady enough to guide a community through the turmoil of nature, then that force had to be sacred. From this they saw every social order as a reflection of the order of the cosmos. A human being could not simply step into that position unless some form of sacred authority had been placed upon them. For that reason, the Sumerians believed that kingship descended rather than was created. This image was not a metaphor, it was a declaration. A king was not merely an individual sitting on a throne, he was someone who carried within himself a fragment of cosmic order. It was this type of authority that kept a community from falling apart in a land where everything else shifted constantly. Instead of viewing the king as just a leader, they saw him as a bridge between two realms, one belonging to the ever-changing earth, the other to the enduring forces that held the universe together. In those days, before borders or written laws existed, this belief shaped everything. It made people accept that stability was a gift sent through the person of the king. It made every decision, whether dividing farmland, organizing labor, holding festivals, or waging war, glow with a certain sacred weight. And more than that, it created the foundation for how the Sumerians recorded history. For if kingship truly came from the heavens, then each king mattered not only because of the years he ruled, but because of the role he played in a cosmic sequence set in motion by the divine. This way of thinking is what gives the Sumerian king list its unique beauty. It is not a record in the modern sense. It is a way for an ancient people to describe the movement of kingship as if it were a living entity. Dynasties were not listed according to military power, but according to who carried the sacred flame of the universe in each era. That is why the earliest kings appear with lifespans that stretch beyond the limits of human possibility, because in their view, the meaning of authority did not lie in human longevity, but in the length of the order that each king preserved during times of immense uncertainty. When we understand this worldview, we see that the Sumerians were not exaggerating history or turning it into myth, They were trying to preserve the feeling of an age when peace and order were so fragile that people believed they could only exist if they descended from the heavens. And it is from this belief that the next chapter of history unfolds, where the first kings step forward, rising from the thin mist between reality and legend. As the idea of a heaven-sent kingship still echoed softly within the consciousness of early communities, the southern floodplains of Mesopotamia began gathering their first settlers into what would become the earliest form of a city, Eridu. A name the Sumerians later spoke with a special reverence, was never just a cluster of homes built beside the water. It was a place they believed held the first spark of human order, where earth and people blended into a sacred center, simple as reed-roofed houses, yet elevated in the same breath as the divine realm they invoked in every ritual. Modern archaeology has uncovered more than 18 layers of construction beneath Eridu's salty soil, stacked across thousands of years. Each layer tells the story of a different moment in the life of the settlement. Small mud-brick shrines, modest altars, and then gradually larger and more refined structures, signs that Eridu was not merely a dwelling place but the spiritual heart of a community far greater than its physical size. In those traces we see that the Sumerians lived with structure, with belief, and with a shared figure to look toward. It was here that they placed their very first king. His name was Alulim, regarded as the first king of humankind, ruling for a span so long it falls far outside the limits of a human lifespan. That number, though impossible to explain biologically, can be understood through the language of symbolism. When they said Alulim ruled for tens of thousands of years, it was their way of saying that the order he represented endured long enough to shape an entire culture, long enough to lay the earliest bricks of what we now call Sumerian society. For the Sumerians, the worth of a king lay not in the number of years lived, but in the staying power of the era his presence created. After Alulim came his successor, Alalngar, also described with a reign stretching beyond the bounds of reality. But the distance between the unreal and the real in Sumerian thought was never a sharp dividing line. It was soft, like the bending of river water, shaped by what their collective memory needed to preserve. When they wrote that Alalngar sustained a long age of stability, it reflected their belief that this period was a time when people lived in harmony with nature, untouched by warfare or struggles over power. Seen through modern eyes, these kings are not historical figures in the strict sense, but they form a core part of humanity's early psychological history. They represent how early people imagined their origins, not beginning with chaos, but with guidance from forces larger than themselves. Archaeologists have found evidence of life at Eridu from more than 8,000 years ago, a time when humans were only beginning to form large communities. This steady growth suggests that the collective memory of the first kings may hold a deeper truth, that there once were leaders, guides, and stabilizing figures who helped their people survive in a land still ruled by uncertainty. And Eridu itself became the cradle of that belief. Kings like Alulim and Alalngar are not merely names in a list. They are the way ancient people preserved the feeling of a beginning, the first moment when a community looked up to the sky in search of the source of order. From that foundation, Eridu became the echo of an age suspended between myth and reality, an age when the Sumerians believed the world was young, the earth still soft, and kingship touched human life from above through the figures of their earliest rulers. From the very ground where Eridu lit up its first layers of memory, the flow of history continues a short way north before pausing at Bad Tibira, the city the Sumerians considered the center of the ancient metalworkers. If Eridu represented the spiritual beginning, then Bad Tibira added a different depth to the story of kingship, a depth shaped by labor, by the human hand, standing face to face with fire and metal. It was here, in the glow of blazing furnaces, that people understood why the earliest kings before the Great Flood were tied to metallurgy, a craft that seems primitive to us now, but for them was a symbol of power and transformation. In Bad Tibira, old stories tell that the kings, or those regarded as kings, ruled the city through their mastery over fire, a force that set humanity apart from every living creature around them. And when we look at the archaeological record, we find early metal tools, spearheads, blades, casting molds, and traces of workshops that prove metallurgy emerged very early. This shows that metalworking was not merely an economic activity, but a system of knowledge passed from generation to generation, a foundation that allowed early communities to maintain strength and stability. The Sumerians viewed metalworking as an act that mirrored the work of the gods. Enki, the god of wisdom and craftsmanship, was believed to be the first to understand how to shape metal. Because of that, anyone who possessed this skill stood closer to the divine realm than the rest of the community. In those days, political authority and manual skill flowed into each other, creating the image of rulers who embodied two faces at once: the human face of those who shaped the world with fire and tools, and the sacred face of those who carried knowledge believed to come from a higher realm. In a society that had not yet fully separated the roles of manager, laborer, and spiritual guide, a king associated with metalworking felt entirely natural. The Sumerian king list names Enmen-Lu'ana, Enmen-Gal-Ana, and Dumuzid the shepherd as rulers of Bad Tibira in the time before the Great Flood. Each name symbolizes not just an individual, but an era in which metal tools were reshaping the structure of society. And the image of Dumuzid, a king who was both a shepherd and a divine figure in Sumerian belief, reflects how ancient people elevated labor into something sacred. To them, the one who could tend flocks, cultivate fields, and forge tools was the one who secured the survival of the entire community. That is why placing someone like Dumuzid in the role of king never created tension in the Sumerian mind. Instead, it made authority feel grounded and reasonable. Metalworking, or with its heat, its fire, and its ability to create something stronger than anything nature offered, made Bad Tibira a symbol of human-made strength, a strength humanity produced for the first time with its own intelligence and labor. The kings tied to this craft represented not only power, but transformation, from stone to metal, from disorder to order, from individual effort to communal life. And so even though this era exists between myth and history, Bad Tibira holds a crucial place in Sumerian memory as the site where power first gained a concrete, tangible form. As we move past Bad Tibira, the journey of kingship continues farther to the north, towards cities like Larag, Zimbir, and Shurupak, places standing on the edge of a final chapter before a great upheaval swept across the land, leaving its mark not only on clay tablets, but on the imagination of humanity for thousands of years to come. Leaving Bad Tibira behind, the path of kingship continues along the thin strip of land between the two widening rivers, reaching the cities the Sumerians named with words that now echo only faintly: Larag, Zimbir, and Shurupak. Each place carries a different shade within ancient memory, like three layers of a story moving steadily toward a turning point. The turning point the Sumerians later spoke of with deep reverence: the Great Flood. Larag, a city rarely mentioned in surviving texts, appears like a resting point for kingship, a place where belief in divine protection remained intact, yet the texture of daily life began to grow thicker. Archaeologists have found few tangible remains directly linked to Larag, but that very silence gives it an air of mystery, a gap in collective memory that invites us to imagine a moment when communities were shifting from simple economies toward more complex forms of life. The soil around this region shows traces of extended cultivation, hints of ancient floodplains shaped and adjusted by human hands to match the unpredictable flow of water. Perhaps it was this constant conversation with the rivers that made Larag the place where people felt most clearly that the world could change without warning, that everything familiar could be swept away by a single season of high water. Then comes Zimbir, commonly identified with Sippar, the city the Sumerians believed to be the dwelling place of Utu, the sun god. Ideas of light, justice, and cosmic order were especially strong here, creating a tonal shift from Eridu or Bad Tibira. Stories of the kings who ruled Zimbir carry clear symbolic weight. They are described as keepers of balance, defenders of light, in an age when humanity still did not fully understand the rhythms of nature. Clay tablets found around Sippar show that its people paid great attention to recording observations, tracking the sun's movement, and planning agricultural cycles. This reveals that order for them was not only a religious idea, but a practical method of living without being overtaken by nature's unpredictability. Under the intense sun pouring down on the plains, they learned to see each day as a cycle that had to be preserved, and that feeling seeped into the stories of their kings, becoming inseparable from their identity. Finally, there is Shuruppak, the place where history and myth blend most densely. This is the home of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the man who survived the Great Flood in a vast boat the gods instructed him to build. What makes Shuruppak remarkable is not only the legend, but the archaeological layers that reveal traces of a major flood around the year 2900 before the Common Era. An uncanny match with the stories the Sumerians left behind. Archaeologists discovered an unusually thick layer of silt buried between habitation levels, as if the city had been swallowed and rebuilt right atop its own still wet remains. Looking at that layer, it is difficult not to picture the residents living their ordinary days, unaware that the river might surge so suddenly that no one would have time to call out to one another. In the spiritual life of Shuruppak, people clung strongly to rituals concerned with protection and survival. Fragments of clay tablets recording moral advice, some of the oldest proverbs in the world, were found here, revealing that Shurupak's inhabitants viewed wisdom as the only true shield against uncertainty. They likely understood that nature was not an enemy but a force humans had to negotiate with in humility, and when we read the warnings they left for future generations. Do not build your house too close to the river, for the anger of the water will reclaim what belongs to it. We feel a fear that is both deeply real and deeply human. These three cities, forming the chain that stretches from Eridu to Bad Tibira and then to Larag, Zimbir, and Shuruppak, create the final tableau before a great upheaval touched this land. The stories of the pre-flood kings in this context are no longer vague or distant. They become reflections of an age when people lived in a state both peaceful and fragile, unaware that they were standing at the very edge of an event that would imprint itself on humanity's memory forever. From the thick layers of silt uncovered at Shuruppak, the story the Sumerians told about the Great Flood suddenly feels much closer to reality. It is no longer just a tale carried through time to teach moral lessons. It becomes the memory of an event that truly swept across the meeting point of the two great rivers. As that layer of earth rests beneath 7 meters of sediment, it stands like a reminder that there was once a time when the waters rose so quickly that they shattered every effort humans made to hold on to the world they knew. And faced with such helplessness, the Sumerians chose to speak of the event in the language of the gods. In their mythology, the Great Flood is described as an act by the gods to cleanse the world. But beneath that layer of symbolism lies a very human reaction, using myth to rewrite memories of something too vast, too violent to be recorded in ordinary words. The people of that era relied entirely on the rhythm of the rivers, or water for crops, for fishing, for survival. Water was a mother, but it could also turn into a blade that cut through everything. And when the rising river drowned the cities along the plains, that memory was preserved by transforming it into a divine story. Archaeology shows that many parts of Mesopotamia contain unusual silt layers dated to around the year 2900 before the Common Era. During that period, the residents of Shuruppak, Kish, and many other settlements were affected by severe flooding. Geologists note that the climate at the time experienced sharp fluctuations. Rainfall increased suddenly, and meltwater from the northern mountains sent enormous volumes of water rushing toward the plains. These changes disrupted the normal river cycles, and just one exceptionally wet year could turn this wide, flat land into a vast inland sea. The evidence of life before the disaster remains visible in the food remnants: charred barley by the hearth, beans and flax seeds drying in small trenches, fish bones and sheep bones mixed into layers of ash. All of these come from the same occupation layer lying just beneath the debated silt deposit. They show that the people of the region lived a river-bound life, fish as the main source of protein, barley as the staple crop, and oils pressed from palms and sesame as essential parts of their meals. A life that was settled, organized, habitual. And precisely because of that, the loss became even more striking when the waters arrived. Pre-flood architecture also reveals a well-developed society. Mud brick houses with multiple rooms, storage areas, ovens, and inner courtyards open to the southern winds paint the image of a community far beyond the stage of mere subsistence. They had buildings, construction methods, and routines repeated across generations. But when the water rose, these mud brick walls dissolved faster than anything else. No walls survived, only the outlines of foundations remained, as if the entire city had been erased in a single season of flooding. From a genetic perspective, modern studies show that the people of Mesopotamia during that era were a blend of populations from the Zagros Mountains and the southern plains. This mixture remained stable for thousands of years, but its pattern breaks sharply in the period believed to follow the Great Flood. This suggests that the flooding did not only destroy cities, it forced residents to abandon their ancestral lands, leading to population dispersal. That dispersal may well have been the seed for later legends of long journeys in search of new homes, stories the Sumerians passed down as gentle warnings to each generation. In all of this, the Great Flood myth is not exaggeration. It is the Sumerians' way of softening fear and placing an overwhelming event in the hands of divine forces so that humans could bear the memory without being crushed by it. And when we read those stories today, they still feel half real, half dreamlike, reminding us both of the fragility of life and of the truth that no matter what happens, people will always find a way to retell it in a language beautiful enough for the next generation not only to remember, but to understand. After the Great Flood, when the land was still damp and mud clung to the sides of boats, the Sumerians faced the task of rebuilding a world that had broken. Kish was the first place where they found a foothold again. They had nothing left except memory and the experience of survival, yet they believed that order could be restored if people held on to the customs that had once kept their community alive. So when the first leaders of Kish emerged, they did not claim to be chosen by the heavens. They simply acted as those who kept the rhythm of life returning, making sure the barley grew again, the canals were cleared, and scattered families found their way back home. Stability at that moment was not yet power. It was a fragile thread reconnecting the Sumerians to the ordinary life they had just lost. Kish was not the largest city, nor the oldest, but what made it the starting point of the post-flood age was the role the Sumerians assigned to it, the place where kingship descended once more. If Eridu had been the spiritual cradle of humanity before the flood, Kish became the place where people believed the world was rebuilt after the waters cleansed everything. And this feeling of beginning again turned Kish into a symbol of restored order. The early kings of Kish did not step onto the stage of history with the mythical power of Alulim or Alalngar, but with something far more human: the ability to restore stability, gather the population, reorganize crops, and stand as the anchor after the world had suffered a deep wound. Among them, Jusha is often considered the first ruler of the dynasty. His name suggests the one who stands first, and even though there is no direct archaeological evidence for him, the mere appearance of his name reflects the community's psychological need to acknowledge someone as the pioneer. Following Jusha was Kulasina Bel, a name that can be read roughly as "everyone is master." That phrase is not just a name, it hints at a society still unstable. When everyone is master, it means power was still fragmented, shared by all but truly owned by none. This is the sign of a community transitioning from post-disaster disarray toward the search for a genuine center of authority. Then comes Etana, perhaps the most symbolically layered figure of the first Kish dynasty. Etana, the one who ascended to heaven, is remembered for riding an eagle in search of the plant of birth, a symbol of population renewal and the continuation of the community. When we read these stories, we see that myth did not elevate Etana away from reality. Instead, it highlighted his role, the one who helped his people regain footing, the one who laid the early foundations for an order that would last generations. In the aftermath of the flood, what mattered most was not absolute power, but the ability to make people believe that the future still existed. Archaeology shows that Kish was one of the earliest settlements to recover after the disaster. Religious structures were rebuilt, new habitation layers formed directly on top of flood silt. Mud brick was molded anew, grain storage areas expanded, and the canal system was reactivated. This rapid return suggests that Kish held a geographically advantageous position, slightly higher than southern cities, high enough to avoid deep inundation, yet close enough to absorb displaced populations from destroyed regions. The significance of restoring order in Kish lay not in its size, but in the psychology of its people. After witnessing an event capable of erasing everything, humans need a symbol to believe that order is not temporary. Kish became that symbol. Its earliest kings were not necessarily powerful military rulers, but they possessed something more important in that moment, the ability to reconnect a shared belief. That is why the Sumerians said kingship descended to Kish and not to any other city. They chose the place that felt safe, the place where they believed the divine placed the first stone of the world rebuilt after the flood. From Kish, the flow of Sumerian kingship began to move in a new direction, less mythical, closer to the real, and leaving far more archaeological traces. And from this place the Sumerians entered an age where cities would compete for power, each taking turns carrying the flame of order, paving the way for the legendary names history still remembers today. From the newly rebuilt mud brick foundations of Kish after the Great Flood, the story of kingship continued to unfold through the figure of a leader who carried the hopes of an entire community. And among the names passed down from that era, none sparks the imagination quite like Etana, the king the Sumerians said had flown into the sky. At first, this image sounds like a fragment of pure mythology, but when we look closely at the social psychology of the time, it becomes clear that it was the community's way of expressing what they longed for after the catastrophe, someone who could lift them out of the chaos surrounding them. In Sumerian legend, Etana rides on the back of an eagle, soaring through the heavens in search of the plant of birth, a sacred symbol tied to the restoration of life. After the Great Flood, the population had dwindled, families were scattered, and many settlements had lost their younger generations. The plant of birth, therefore, was not merely a spiritual image, it reflected the community's very real need to restore demographic stability. Etana's quest for that plant was the Sumerians' way of saying that the first king after the disaster had to be someone capable of reviving the vitality of society, whether through leadership, organization, or the power of belief. The eagle symbol is no accident. In Sumerian culture, the eagle existed between two realms, touching the earth but flying higher than any other creature. It embodied the nature of royal authority, part human, part reaching toward the sacred. When Etana rides the eagle, it is a declaration that he could reconnect the community with a higher order, something desperately needed in a society still wounded by the flood. In the tablets found at Assur and Nineveh, Etana's story does not portray him through the voice of the gods, but through more relatable images. A difficult journey, hesitation, fear of heights, and a dialogue between a man and the creature guiding him. These details reveal that Etana was not viewed as a god, but as a human confronting his own limits in order to bring something vital back to his people. That effort, that willingness to step into the unknown on behalf of others, is the very substance of political authority, for people trust a leader only when they see him brave the uncertainties they cannot face themselves. Etana also carries another meaning. He symbolizes a king who does not simply sit on a throne, but one who ascends. In Sumerian thought, going upward was not merely physical directions, it was spiritual direction, the direction society needed in order to rise from its heavy past. At that moment, when everything was still unstable, telling the story of a king who flew to the heavens to petition for renewed life was a way for the community to reassure itself that the newly restored order was not temporary or fragile, but something acknowledged by the divine. Socially, Etana served as the link between the generation that survived the disaster and the new generation just beginning to emerge. His story was told within families, in rituals, in night gatherings, a reminder that authority was not only inherited within a royal line, but granted by the community based on genuine value. And the value they needed most at that time was the ability to protect life, the first condition for any civilization to endure. There is no direct archaeological evidence proving Etana as a historical figure in the strict sense, but the signs of population recovery in Kish during the post-flood period align closely with the social role the legend assigns to him. A newly rebuilt community in need of numbers, alliances, and stability would naturally choose a figure symbolizing renewal as its emblem. For that reason, Etana, whether a real person or the collective memory of an era, remains a mirror of the society's state of mind, their longing to rebuild order and continue humanity's journey. Etana's story, then, is not merely a piece of mythology. It is the whisper of a community learning to stand again after seeing how fragile it truly was. And from that whisper, Sumerian kingship began to take on a clearer shape, guiding the way for the names that would soon step into the space where legend and history start to intertwine. As the story of Etana continued to echo, like the effort of a community reaching upward from the shadow of disaster, the timeline of Sumer began moving into a phase where myth was no longer spoken only in words. It started leaving marks in the soil itself. In the king list of Kish, the name Enme-Barajesi appears like a bridge between two worlds. On one side, a long line of rulers who lived in stretches of time far beyond reality, and on the other, a history that can be touched, measured through artifacts, and verified by science. And it is this king who stands as the first in the entire list to be confirmed by archaeological evidence. In the tradition, Enme-Barajsi is described as the one who defeated the Elamites, bringing an era of stability to Kish after generations of rebuilding and facing threats from outside. His story feels far more grounded than those before him. No eagle, no ascent into the heavens, no reign lasting thousands of years, only war, conflict, and political authority in a form closer to what we recognize today. And it is perhaps precisely this closeness to reality that left his imprint behind. The first evidence surfaced on a pottery fragment unearthed at Kafaja, where archaeologists found his name written in a context completely free of myth. The inscription does not recount heroic feats or divine interventions. It merely records an administrative event, as if his name was simply the name of a ruler who truly governed. Its plainness is what shocked historians because it breaks the long-held distance between oral legends and surviving material remains. More than that, in the region of Nippur, a ceremonial stone vessel carved from diorite was discovered, also bearing his name in early cuneiform. What drew special attention was the material itself. Diorite does not occur naturally in the Mesopotamian plain. To obtain it, the Sumerians had to import it from far away, something only individuals with wide authority and extensive control could manage. A diorite object dedicated in a temple strongly suggests that the name carved on it cannot belong to a mere mythic figure. It must have belonged to a real person, a political figure living in an era when networks of exchange and central management were beginning to take shape. The archaeological layers at Kish show a clear shift in architecture and urban organization during the period believed to correspond to the reign of Enme-Baraj-Esi. Mud brick was fired more evenly, religious structures built more solidly, and the city layout showed emerging separation between residential and administrative zones. These developments reflect a central authority quietly forming, one powerful enough to shape urban planning and coordinate communal labor, and the presence of a strong military leader like Enme-Barajsi aligns perfectly with the physical evidence telling that story. Another factor supporting his historical existence is that his name appears not only in the Sumerian king list, but also in later Akkadian inscriptions. When a figure is referenced by multiple cultures for different reasons, in unrelated contexts, it is often a strong indicator of historicity. The Akkadians had no reason to repeat a purely Sumerian legend unless the individual had left a mark significant enough to remain in memory. From pottery shards, stone vessels, and the buried architecture beneath the earth, the image of Enme-Baraj-Si begins to come into focus, not as a king who soared into the heavens or ruled across impossible eras, but as a flesh-and-blood leader guiding a recovering community after the flood, confronting external powers and rebuilding authority on practical foundations. For this reason, he becomes the first clear proof that the Sumerian king list is not made solely of myth. It also preserves real history, woven between layers of symbolism and ancient belief. The presence of Enme-Baraj-Si shines like a lantern at the border between legend and history, showing us that the Sumerian world was not as detached from reality as many ancient cultures. They recorded their memory in a language capable of traveling between two realms, the imagined and the tangible. And it is at this intersection that history begins to take shape, to take weight, and to leave traces for later generations to touch as they continue the journey into the origins of human kingship. From the earliest glimpses of verified kingship emerging through the name Enme Barrage Si, the history of Sumer leads us toward a place where human footsteps pressed into the soil so deeply that they formed a true civilization. And right on that ground, across the flat expanse of cultivated fields, a city began to rise as if born from humanity's desire to step beyond isolated living and begin something greater. That city was Uruk, the first place in human history where a city, in the full sense of the word, truly appeared. In archaeological layers, Uruk unfolds as a complex network in which small, earlier settlements gradually merged into sprawling clusters. Instead of living in separate, scattered groups, the people here gathered into dense communities, sharing labor, sharing knowledge, and sharing responsibility for works too large for any single household. The traces of streets, canals, workshops, and grain warehouses reveal that Uruk was not merely a place to live. It was a living organism, with each space serving a function and every worker woven into the larger structure. Walking into Uruk at that time must have felt like stepping into a newly created world. Rows of mud brick houses lined the walkways. Inner courtyards opened wide for drying grain and carrying out daily work. Weaving and pottery workshops ran without pause, and clusters of skilled craftsmen produced goods that would be traded for raw materials from distant lands. Rising above everything were the temples, massive structures marking the spiritual and political heart of the city. Within these temples, people performed rituals, coordinated resources, and recorded every transaction using the earliest symbols of writing. It was in Uruk that writing emerged out of the need for administration. Clay tablets inscribed with marks representing goods produced, stored, or transported show that power here did not depend solely on military force or mythology, but on the ability to control information. Whoever managed the flow of commodities and labor controlled the city. Thus, power in Uruk was the power of organization, a completely new idea in human history. From this new structure, a new ladder of authority emerged, where a king was not merely someone believed to be chosen by the gods, but someone who oversaw a complex web of work and people. One of the clearest symbols of Uruk's power was its city wall. Uruk was surrounded by walls stretching for tens of kilometers, built from millions of sun-dried mud bricks, an achievement that demanded a level of labor and organization beyond anything seen before. The walls were not only defenses, they were the city's declaration that it could shape and protect itself. Standing atop them, the people of Uruk could look out over the vast plain and realize they were no longer small groups dependent entirely on the rains. They had become a community large enough to inscribe itself upon the earth. The walls also created the first sense of boundary between inside and outside, beginning the idea of a city as a distinct entity separate from nature. Inside was order, labor divided, tasks defined. Outside was the unbounded plain, where the rivers could shift course at any moment. This contrast made Uruk a symbol of humanity's ambition to build an artificial world within the natural one. And it was in Uruk that personal authority began to gain definition through monuments bearing the names of kings. As monumental works became symbols of power and communal labor became the means to build them, authority no longer rested only in stories or religious belief, but in the visible ability to impose order onto the physical world. Anyone entering Uruk at that time could see power, not hidden in prayers, but standing tall in structures so high they cast shadows across the city. Standing in Uruk must have felt like standing within the first heartbeat of an urban world, the heat of brick kilns rising into the air, the rhythmic striking of craftsmen shaping stone and clay, streams of people carrying baskets of grain through narrow passages, and at the center a great temple beating like the heart of the entire urban body. These rhythms made Uruk fundamentally different from every place before it, a difference that could never be undone. From this point on, the history of Sumer entered an age in which people did not merely live upon the land but shaped the land with their own hands. Amid this architecture and vitality, the earliest leaders of Uruk were preparing to step into history, carrying stories that would one day turn the city into a legend for all of humanity. Amid the high city walls and the vibrant, growing rhythm of Uruk, a new need slowly emerged. A need that did not come from the land or the rivers, but from the very complexity the city itself had created. The more people gathered, the more goods circulated, the more buildings rose, the clearer it became that memory and spoken words were no longer enough. Craftsmen could not argue every day over who delivered how many batches of pottery or who still owed how much grain. Temple administrators could not rely solely on recollection to distribute supplies, and a king overseeing a rapidly expanding urban organism could not depend only on oral commands. It was in this setting that the name Enmerkar appeared, tied to one of humanity's greatest turning points, the birth of writing. According to tradition, Enmerkar ruled Uruk at a time when the city had grown large enough to trade with faraway regions, but also complex enough that those exchanges could easily slip into chaos. The story the Sumerians told of him and the distant city of Arata reflects the political and economic needs of the era. Information had to be precise, messages had to be clear, and authority had to be strengthened through administrative ability, not just power. In the legend, Enmerkar sends a series of messages to Arata demanding precious materials for the temple of Inanna. But each time the messenger returned from the long journey, the message had grown longer, more intricate, harder to convey. At a certain point, the tale says the messenger's memory could no longer bear the weight, and in that moment Enmerkar pressed clay flat and marked it with signs. Though told in mythical language, this story reflects a simple truth. Writing was born not from artistic inspiration or a desire to tell stories, but from an urgent practical need, the need to manage information. Those early marks were not writing in the modern sense. They were symbols for goods, barley, livestock counts, quantities of products, impressed onto wet clay and then baked into records that could not be forgotten, altered, or reshaped to fit someone's recollection. And from those simple economic symbols, cuneiform slowly evolved into a tool capable of recording every aspect of life. But from the very beginning, writing carried a deeply political purpose. It allowed those in power to control the movement of goods and labor. For Enmerkar, writing was also a means of creating distance, a form of authority others could not match. When a king could freeze information into clay, he rose above communities still dependent on fallible human memory. Information became material, became power in its own right. A clay tablet could travel between cities across seasons, through many hands without its content changing, providing the stability needed to build a government, collect taxes, allocate labor, and maintain diplomatic relations. Archaeology confirms this through hundreds of clay tablets from the late Uruk period filled with the earliest signs of writing. All of them concern administration, grain tallies, livestock lists, storage records, labor assignments, workshops, workforce numbers. Not a single tablet recounts myths or stories of daily life. This shows that writing was first and foremost a product of the administrative apparatus, a tool to keep Uruk from collapsing under its own weight. and from this moment onward, humanity could finally surpass the limits of memory. Once information was pressed onto clay, it no longer depended on any individual. The appearance of writing meant the appearance of continuity, the ability for one generation to pass down precise information to the next without distortion. This was the foundation that transformed a settlement into a civilization. Enmerkar, then, is not merely a figure of legend. He is the face of necessity, the necessity that forced humans to find a way to stabilize authority, reorganize life, and prevent disorder as society grew too large to manage by memory alone. And writing, as the invention attributed to him, became the embodiment of that administrative power. Through it, Uruk not only grew faster than any city before it, but became the model that later civilizations would follow. From the moment writing appeared, the world was no longer the same. And in that transformed setting, the next rulers of Uruk, especially those who straddle both history and myth, began to step into the center of humanity's story. From the moment writing began to slip into the daily life of Uruk and allowed information to exist beyond human memory, the stories of the city's early rulers began to take on new layers of meaning. And among the names remembered as the ones who laid the foundations for humanity's first true city, Lugalbanda appears with a particularly shimmering, dreamlike quality. He does not sit fully within the realm of myth, nor does he stand entirely in the clear light of history. He occupies a threshold, a place where human and divine nearly touch in the imagination of the Sumerians. According to Sumerian tradition, Lugalbanda was one of the early kings of Uruk, remembered as the father of Gilgamesh. But the tales told about him stretch far beyond the frame of an earthly leader. In the inscriptions, he is portrayed as a man of extraordinary strength, someone who could run faster than the wind and find paths through distant, uncharted lands where no one else dared to go. Ancient texts describe him wandering through remote mountains, cared for by sacred beings, and returning transformed with new strength. These depictions are not the way one describes an ordinary person. They reveal how a community lifted its leader to a higher plane to reflect their own aspirations. What makes Lugalbanda remarkable is not simply the supernatural episodes associated with him, but why the Sumerians told such stories. After Uruk expanded and society grew increasingly complex, the role of a king was no longer just to govern or manage resources. The king became a symbol of order, of strength, of the ability to face what lay beyond human control. And when a society believed that its stability originated in the divine, elevating the king closer to the gods felt natural. At that time, the Sumerians did not deify their rulers because they saw no clear boundary between humans and gods. They did it because they needed a way to explain how one person could stand at the center of such a large, intricate community. A leader had to be someone who could rise above fear, above harsh environments, above chaos. And the simplest way to express that was to tie him to supernatural aid. Thus, saying that Lugalbanda was helped by divine beings did not make him distant. It made his authority more understandable, more justified in the minds of the people. Archaeology supports this atmosphere of heightened expectation. The period of Uruk's expansion was marked by intense competition between city-states, which meant kings needed to be seen as protectors operating on a level above ordinary men. Massive city walls, monumental temples, and the concentration of resources into collective projects all reinforced the idea that the ruler was chosen by the gods. A leader relying solely on physical strength could not inspire an entire city to labor for projects far beyond individual gain, but a leader viewed as divinely appointed could. The stories about Lugalbanda reflect this social psychology with striking clarity. He is not celebrated for dramatic military victories, but for undergoing a profound trial that made him more than human. His journey symbolizes the desire of the Sumerians to see their king as someone who had touched the other world and returned with guidance. Deifying the king did not push him away. It turned him into a spiritual anchor for a society growing increasingly complex. Through the image of Lugalbanda, we see how the Sumerians used myth to fill the gap between human capability and communal expectation. And from that very threshold, the meeting point of human will and divine imagination, Sumer was preparing to welcome the figure who would inherit both real power and mythic radiance and step into one of the most enduring stories humanity has ever told. From the half-mythic figure of Lugalbanda, the story of kingship in Uruk moves toward a name whose shadow stretches across both history and world literature: Gilgamesh. When the clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Nineveh revealed his tale, it became clear that this was not merely a spiritual symbol, but a man who once walked on real ground, ruled a real city, and carved his presence into collective memory in a way no one before him ever had. Gilgamesh was not just a king, he was a mirror reflecting everything the Sumerians believed about life, death, power, and the longing to remain within humanity's remembrance. In the oldest surviving texts, Gilgamesh appears in the list of Uruk's rulers, believed to have reigned around the year 2600 before the Common Era. What stands out is that he is portrayed as too strong, too resolute, too large for an ordinary human, yet he performs no miracles, wields no supernatural powers like purely mythological heroes. This larger-than-life but still human quality made him the perfect vessel for the Sumerians to pour their deepest philosophy into, that death is the boundary no one can cross, but memory can. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he journeys across deserts, climbs mountains, and battles monstrous foes, but these feats are not just about strength. They are a journey into the nature of human finitude. When his closest companion, Enkidu, dies, Gilgamesh faces the greatest terror of all, the fear that when death arrives, every power, every monument, every victory he created will vanish like sand slipping downriver. That moment drives him to search for immortality, not as a god, but as a man suddenly aware of his own smallness in the vastness of the world. The Sumerians lived in a land where death was never far. Floods could erase villages, disease could arrive without warning, and wars between city-states could break out at any moment. So when they told the story of a king unmatched in strength, yet humbled by the fear of death, they were speaking the truth of the entire community. Death was not seen as an enemy, but as the final boundary within the universe's order. And that order could not be broken, not even by the greatest of men. Sumerian philosophy saw death not as darkness, but as a reminder that glory lies not in living forever, but in living so that one's name does not disappear. And so what Gilgamesh eventually found was not immortality of the body, but immortality through memory. When he returned to Uruk and looked upon its towering walls and the roads he had built with his own hands, he understood that what lasts longest is not the human body, but the marks we leave upon our community. For the Sumerians, true power did not lie in force, but in creating something that compelled future generations to speak one's name. A king could die, but the walls he built, the systems he established, and the stories told about him would outlive the darkness of time. That is why Gilgamesh became inseparable from Sumerian consciousness, not as a god to separate him from humanity, but as a magnified form of human longing, making mortal fears and desires easier to see. Immortality, in the Sumerian sense, did not mean living forever. It meant being remembered forever. Death was unavoidable, but memory could resist it. Gilgamesh, in failing to achieve eternal life, accidentally attained the very thing he sought, the immortality of reputation. More than 4,000 years have passed, yet his name is still spoken, his story still told, and his journey still inspires people to turn inward and ask who they are. Through Gilgamesh, the Sumerians did not merely tell the story of a king, they told the story of humanity itself. And through him, the world learned that a civilization truly begins the moment it asks, "What will we leave behind when we are no longer here?" As the walls of Uruk still echoed with the lingering presence of Gilgamesh, the lands of southern Sumer began to shift in another way, quietly, yet profoundly. The Euphrates drifted past newly layered floodplains built from generations of rising waters and settling silt, and along one of its wide bends, another city slowly rose, not through the thunder of epic tales, but through endurance, organization, and commercial strength. That city was Ur, and it was here that the first dynasty of Ur began to leave its mark on the political landscape of Sumer. Ur owed much of its rise to its geography. Positioned near the trade routes of the Persian Gulf, it had direct access to a network connecting Mesopotamia with distant coastal regions. Goods flowed constantly: timber, precious stones, raw metal, woven fabrics, creating a robust merchant class and making Ur an economic center long before it became a military presence. In a time when Sumerian city-states were competing fiercely for fertile land and influence, Ur began to seek a role not merely as a trading hub, but as a power. At this stage, Sumer was not a unified empire. Each city-state functioned as its own small kingdom with its own temple, its own patron deity, and its own ambitions. Uruk held onto its cultural prestige under Gilgamesh's shadow. Kish remained revered as the city where kingship had descended after the Great Flood, and Ur thrived on the steady movement of cargo boats and river trade. These cities rotated through cycles of dominance, each striving to claim a coveted title. Lugal of Sumer, a leader of all city-states, even if only symbolically. In this competitive landscape, the first dynasty of Ur emerged almost inevitably. Its founder, known as Mesanapada, was among the first Sumerian rulers to inscribe his name with the weight of genuine authority. What set him apart was his ability to transform economic advantage into political strength. Rather than depending solely on warfare or tradition, he tightened Ur's control over trade routes and formed ties with regions farther down the Gulf, ensuring a stable flow of resources that allowed Ur to break free from the constant tug-of-war among the northern cities. Clay tablets show that Mesanapada not only ruled Ur, but also claimed the title King of Kish, a name loaded with symbolic power. If kingship had once descended to Kish after the Great Flood, then a ruler of Ur seizing that title signaled a profound shift in the balance of power. It was a moment when authority no longer resided permanently in any single city, but could be claimed by whoever controlled resources, manpower, and the faith of the community. Ur's granaries, workshops, and administrative quarters expanded rapidly. Around its port, neighborhoods thickened with traders, craftsmen, and laborers. Looms hummed in weaving halls, and baked brick temples rose layer by layer, testifying to the wealth piling up within the city's walls. As Mesanapada laid the foundations of the first dynasty of Ur, he built his power not by the sword alone, but through an economic network that compelled other city-states to take notice. The rivalry between Uruk, Kish, and Ur at this time resembled three competing heartbeats, each trying to regulate the lifeblood of Sumer. Uruk held its ancient prestige and spiritual weight, Kish its historical legitimacy and northern stronghold, while Ur controlled the gateway to the sea, the place where wealth flowed in. And whenever one of these heartbeats quickened faster than the others, all of Sumer shifted accordingly. What made the first dynasty of remarkable was how this shift unfolded clearly, yet without drama. No epic poems celebrated its triumphs, no supernatural feats defined its rulers. Instead, there were clay tablets documenting transactions, decrees, storeroom inventories, and diplomatic exchanges. These quiet records became proof that had stepped forward, not as a mythic power, but as a master of real life in southern Sumer. The first dynasty of did not last long enough to become legend like Gilgamesh, but the reconfiguration of power it triggered reshaped all of Sumer. When showed that a wealthy city could become a political center, the balance among the city-states tilted southward, setting the stage for an even larger transformation when a new force rising from the lands between the Tigris and the northern grasslands began to threaten the entire order Sumer had built. As began asserting its place through a quiet but undeniable prosperity, the whole of Mesopotamia seemed to fall into a new rhythm, one in which the Sumerian city-states no longer faced only each other, but also the steady rise of new groups from the north. From the grasslands of Akkad came people with a different way of life, a different language, and a presence that slowly threaded itself into the economic and military systems of the south, almost unnoticed. For generations they served in Sumerian armies, lived in northern districts near Kish, joined commercial networks, and, little by little, the land they called Akkad became a center heating up beneath the sediment of history. And within that growing pressure, a figure emerged, one whose story opened an entirely new era, Sargon, founder of the Akkadian Empire. In ancient inscriptions, Sargon tells of his humble origins, placed in a basket on a river, rescued, and raised by a gardener. The tale echoes the birth stories of many ancient heroes, but here its meaning is different. It is not a tool for deification, but a statement that this new power was rising from outside the old order. The Akkadians had never been part of the traditional leadership structure of Sumer, and that distance is precisely what made them unpredictable. They were not bound by the rules that Sumer had lived under for millennia. Sargon did not build his authority through myth, he built it through military organization. Gathering troops from the northern settlements, he used swift, flexible tactics very different from the localized wars that dominated Sumerian politics. When Kish began to destabilize, when Uruk and were still vying for supremacy, he stepped into the vacuum. More importantly, he understood that unifying this land required breaking the fragmentation Sumer had preserved for so long. His campaigns are not remembered through epic poetry like the tales of Gilgamesh. They appear instead in clay records, blunt and precise. Sargon conquered city-state after city-state, not to destroy them, but to pull them into a centralized administrative network. For the first time in history, Sumer was no longer a constellation of independent cities. It became part of a larger empire. With Akkad as its heart, the region that had once led humanity in culture and urban innovation began to lose its singular position. The irony is striking. The very tools Sumer had developed, writing, administration, accounting, state organization, became the instruments Akkad used to rule over them. Sargon did not dismantle the Sumerian system, he expanded it. His letters were written in cuneiform, his decrees used the bureaucratic language of Uruk and Kish. The tax systems, warehouses, and military structures he strengthened followed models Sumer had built generations earlier. This turning point marks a shift, not of destruction, but of absorption. Sumer did not disappear, but its central role was overtaken by a more unified, more ambitious power. The city of Akkad, still undiscovered by archaeologists, was once the beating heart of the world's first empire. Sargon made it his capital, ruling both north and south from there. The decline of Sumer as the center of power did not happen in the roar of war, but in the quiet realization that every major decision now passed through Akkad before reaching the southern cities. This new equilibrium pushed Sumer into a period where continuity and overshadowing happened simultaneously, shaped by a power they no longer fully controlled. The Sumerians, with their deep traditions of writing and ritual, remained culturally grounded. But as Sargon redirected trade routes, centralized the army, and coordinated labor on a massive scale, the dependence of the southern city-states on Akkad became unmistakable. The empire ruled not only through strength, but through its skillful use of the Sumerian system, turned now into an imperial machine. On surviving clay tablets, the Sumerians wrote of Sargon with a mix of respect and unease. For this was not merely the rise of a new dynasty, it was the first time Sumer had seen itself no longer at the forefront. And that shift opened the path to centuries of deep cultural and political convergence, ushering the land into a phase where the boundary between Sumer and Akkad became softer, more blended, and eventually inseparable. The rise of Akkad under Sargon did not erase Sumer. Instead, it opened a strange and remarkable period in which two worlds began to overlap. On one side stood an ancient civilization whose memory stretched back to the time before the Great Flood. On the other stood a young, agile power driven by an ambition to expand beyond every traditional boundary. When the Akkadian Empire took control, the region was not split in two. It became a woven network of cultural, military, and religious threads, so tightly interlaced that no one could truly say where Sumer ended and Akkad began. They blended, seeped into each other, and formed the hybrid age that later generations would simply call Sumer-Akkad, as if only a single name could contain the reality of that moment. Nowhere was this merging clearer than in language and writing. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic tongue, the Sumerians spoke a language unrelated to any known family. Yet when the empire took shape, Akkadian gradually became the language of administration, diplomacy, and the military. Even so, writing retained the structure of the Sumerians, the wedge-shaped cuneiform pressed into clay. Akkadian words had to fold themselves into Sumerian writing conventions, and the Sumerians had to grow accustomed to Akkadian rhythms and vocabulary. The result was a dual system, where every tablet carried the imprint of both peoples. In this period, Akkad did not replace Sumer, nor did Sumer reclaim old dominance. The two civilizations learned to operate within the same machinery. The military reflected the same blend. The Akkadians excelled in organized warfare, building standing armies and adopting tactics unfamiliar to Sumerian city-states, which were more accustomed to defending walls than launching campaigns. Yet Sumerians held the deep traditions of craft, especially metalworking inherited from Bad Tibera and the southern cities. When these strengths met, the empire's army became a force that was both disciplined and exceptionally equipped. Surviving monuments depict Akkadian soldiers wearing bronze helmets, long spears, and hide-covered wooden shields, yet their shapes and styles trace clearly to Sumerian origins. Military power in this era was neither purely Akkadian nor purely Sumerian. It was the power of a land remaking itself. Religion offered the clearest proof of this merging. Sumerian gods, Inanna, Enki, Enlil, Nanna, were not replaced. The Akkadians adopted them as their own, simply giving them Semitic names. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea, Nanna became Sin. And beyond renaming, the Akkadians elevated these gods to new roles in ritual and statecraft. Whenever an Akkadian king wished to prove that his authority came from heaven, he did not seek a purely Akkadian deity. He turned to Inanna/Ishtar, the same goddess whom Sumerians had revered for ages. Thus religion did not fracture. It became the bridge binding the empire together. Major cities, Kish, Nippur, Uruk, and Akkad, became dense urban centers where the two peoples lived side by side. They exchanged skills, learned each other's farming techniques, ritual practices, and methods of record-keeping. Sumerian scribes continued running the administration because they knew the writing system, while Akkadian commanders led the military campaigns of expansion. And at these intersections, the shared child of both cultures was born, a system carrying Akkad's strength and Sumer's intellect. Clay tablets from this period reveal how deeply each side respected the other. The Akkadians were astonished by Sumer's cultural depth, while the Sumerians admired Akkad's organizational power. Their connection was more than coexistence, it was mutual recognition. And in this merging flow, Sumer saw itself not as the sole center anymore, but neither as lost. It became the roots, while Akkad became the trunk, together forming a tree of civilization, stronger than any city-state that had existed before. This era of convergence was not a time of loss, it was a time of redefining identity. And from this shared foundation, a new Sumerian dynasty was already gathering strength, ready to bring the southern land back to the center once again, not through conquest, but through the rule of law and the administrative frameworks that Akkad had, unknowingly, helped prepare. From the crossroads where Sumer and Akkad blended into one, reshaping the face of Mesopotamia, history seemed to prepare for yet another shift, one not carried by swords or the ashes of war, but by the quiet authority of orderly lines pressed into clay. As the Akkadian Empire began to weaken under long droughts, political upheaval, and pressure from nomadic groups, southern Sumer found itself with a chance to rise again. And in the midst of this moment, a figure appeared, someone gathering the scattered pieces of order to build a completely new framework. Ur-Nammu, the king who founded the third dynasty of Ur and left behind the earliest known written law code in human history. If writing first emerged in Uruk to serve economic needs, then by the time of Ur-Nammu, writing had matured enough to carry a far greater ambition, an ambition to arrange the world in a logical, structured, and just way. Before this, Sumerian city-states relied mainly on custom, local tradition, and the judgments of temple authorities. But as populations grew, as transactions became more complex, and as new tensions arose from the cultural blending between Sumer and Akkad, a shared legal system became essential. Ur-Nammu, ruling at this turning point, understood that authority no longer came only from military strength. It came from the ability to create a stable order that everyone could depend on. The code of Ur-Nammu, inscribed on clay tablets, begins by declaring that the gods had entrusted the king with the task of bringing justice to the land, eliminating violence, and protecting the weak. This was not ceremonial language. It reflected the very nature of power at the time. The king was not the creator of the law, but the one who made divine justice visible in daily life. The Sumerians believed that true order had to come from the sacred, and the king was its executor, not its owner. For that reason, the code of Ur-Nammu was not the law of one man, it was the law of a higher order believed to stand above humanity. What makes this code remarkable is its approach to justice. Before Ur-Nammu, many disputes were settled through ad hoc compensation, often influenced by the wealth or prestige of each family. Ur-Nammu replaced this uncertainty with fixed penalties, procedures, and obligations. A broken tooth no longer spiraled into endless cycles of revenge, as in some tribal regions. It had a specific compensation in silver. A woman's honor had a defined value. Even damages caused by a slave were regulated. These simple rules opened a new doorway. For the first time, People lived in a space where justice could be measured and predicted rather than left to chance or personal influence. The philosophy behind Ur-Nammu's code was not one of harsh punishment. Instead, it aimed for balance between social classes, between responsibilities and rights, between the strong and the vulnerable. It shows that the Sumerians had realized that the true strength of a state did not come from fear, but from a shared sense of safety. When ordinary people knew that law would stand on their side, if they suffered loss, the king's authority became accepted rather than forced. And this acceptance formed the foundation of the long stability of the Ur-III period. Politically, the Code of Ur-Nammu declared that the king was no longer just a ruler. He was the guardian of a common order. Once behavior, compensation, and responsibility were written down, the king became the anchor of a system no individual could override. This weakened the influence of powerful families and temples that had once controlled much of the judicial process. Every law tablet brought more authority to the center, yet also made justice more accessible to the public. Archaeology shows that during Ur-Nammu's reign, administrative and religious structures were reorganized. Records of grain counts, labor assignments, and production were no longer scattered notations. They followed systematic patterns. This reveals that law was not an isolated document. It was part of a wider mechanism that reshaped how society functioned. For the Sumerians, Ur-Nammu's code also carried spiritual weight. Order was sacred. Chaos was the danger the world must always guard against. Each law was a way for humans to cooperate with the gods in keeping the world upright. The code reveals that the Sumerians did not treat people as subjects needing control. They saw them as participants in a larger universal balance. If that balance held, the community would endure, no matter how many times it had been broken before. Ur-Nammu, therefore, was not merely a king who rebuilt Ur after great upheavals. He laid down an intellectual foundation for the entire region. That power lasts only when rooted in justice, and justice is trusted only when it follows clear, consistent principles, untouched by the whims of individuals. From this belief, the third dynasty of Ur became one of the most stable and brilliant eras in Sumerian history, and humanity gained its first law code, proof that a society could be governed not by fear, but by reason. From the legal foundation, Ur-Nammu laid down like a pillar holding society steady after years of turmoil. The power of the third dynasty of Ur entered a new chapter when his son, Shulgi, ascended the throne. If Ur-Nammu rebuilt the skeleton of order, then Shulgi breathed life into it, creating the full, beating machinery of a state, the first true bureaucratic government in human history. In Sumerian tradition, his name appears with a blend of respect and curiosity, for Shulgi was not only a sweeping reformer, he was also a king who openly proclaimed his own divine nature. And that divine claim was reflected not through mythic miracles, but through a style of governance more organized, more meticulous, and more far-reaching than anything seen before. Shulgi ruled for 40 years, an extraordinary span in an age haunted by war, disease, and political instability. During this long reign, he did not simply continue his father's projects. He expanded everything: temples, granaries, trade routes, and above all, the administrative system. What set Shulgi apart was not the number of monumental buildings he constructed, but the way he made them operate under a unified standard, like parts of a vast machine running smoothly across a land once accustomed to the fragmentation of independent city-states. On surviving clay tablets, Shulgi describes himself as the king who runs like the wind, the strong one, the one upheld by the gods. These phrases are not mere self-flattery, they reveal the logic behind his rule. In a government where administration had replaced much of traditional authority, claiming divine nature transformed his commands from personal orders into sacred decrees, This gave him the legitimacy he needed to centralize power and push reforms into regions long dominated by local elites and temple authorities. One of Shulgi's greatest innovations was the creation of a vast administrative record-keeping system. Granaries, workshops, livestock estates, textile centers. Every institution was required to record every inflow and outflow in exact detail. Hundreds of thousands of clay tablets that survive today testify to how his reign turned written record into the backbone of the state. Local officials could no longer act independently. They had to report through standardized forms, standardized symbols, standardized schedules, all archived in the royal storage rooms. Under this system, all of Sumer became a dense network where each production center, each group of craftsmen, and each herd of animals fell under the calculation of the central government. Shulgi's bureaucracy did not merely manage resources, it managed labor, time, and output. For the first time in history, a state rested not on loyalty or fear alone, but on accounting. Within this context, Shulgi's divine claims take on a different color. He did not invoke divinity to justify tyrannical power. He used it to shoulder the immense weight of running a newly formed bureaucratic world. The Sumerians believed that gods embodied cosmic order, so a king who sought to manage human order needed to stand close to the divine. Shulgi's divine status was not arrogance, it was a political tool that legitimized the enormous system he was building, a system requiring the population to accept a central authority higher than any that had existed before. Alongside administration, Shulgi reformed infrastructure. He built and repaired the roads linking major cities, creating a network of rest stations along travel routes so officials, couriers, and goods could move rapidly. This network made the Third Kingdom a connected realm where information no longer remained trapped within its city walls. These roads became the veins through which trade, taxation, and military coordination could flow with unprecedented efficiency. But what makes Shulgi a great reformer is not only the institutions he strengthened or the laws he refined, it is the way he redefined the role of the individual within the state. Even while proclaiming himself divine, he did not distance himself from human experience. Sumerian poems describe him taking part in festivals, competing in rituals, even running long distances between temples to demonstrate his strength. Symbolic gestures meant to show that the king, though sacred, still lived within the body of the community. Shulgi was therefore a strange and striking fusion, part man, part divine symbol, a ruler who balanced authority with responsibility, administration with spirituality. After him, Sumer was no longer merely a land of city-states. It had become a true state, with territory, bureaucracy, codified laws, taxation systems, and a king standing at the center like the axis of a vast machine. It is no exaggeration to say that the concept of the bureaucratic state, one later embraced by civilizations such as Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and Rome, began here, beneath the shadow of Ur's temples, and in the hands of a king bold enough to claim a share of the divine in order to organize the human world. From the moment Shulgi built a bureaucratic engine that ran across Sumer like a massive living machine, the third dynasty of appeared stronger than anything the region had ever seen. But the more complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to forces no one can see, forces born of nature, economy, and the shifting movements of people on the edges of the world. And so, when Shulgi died, the kings who followed, Amarsin, Shusin, and Ibisin, stepped into a world where the ground beneath their feet was beginning to quietly fracture. Amarsin, Shulgi's immediate successor, was a capable ruler, yet he inherited a state at the very moment its enormous machinery had grown larger than it could sustain. Clay tablets from his reign show a treasury under strain, granaries strained to feed the army, the bureaucratic workforce, and the vast network of officials hired during Shulgi's expansion. At the same time, the climate began to shift. Rainfall decreased, drought stretched year after year, fields in the east and south turned harder to cultivate. Even a slight shift in the Euphrates threatened irrigation canals that needed constant repairs that demanded resources the state no longer had in abundance. Amarsin tried to hold the system together by continuing the construction projects, continuing the rituals, continuing the administrative routines that had defined his father's reign. But these efforts revealed a painful truth. The empire depended on a continuous flow of resources, and once that stream began to thin, the elegant structure of Ur-3 began to sag under its own weight. When Shusin came to the throne, the pressures tightened further. Winds from the northwest carried Amorite pastoral groups, nomadic peoples who did not see borders as lines of authority but as marks in the dust that rain could erase. Driven by hunger and long migration cycles, the Amorites moved toward the fertile south, and the defenses of Ur-3, built for an older era, could not slow them down. Shusin responded by constructing a massive wall across the western frontier, a structure stretching for hundreds of kilometers. It was the largest defensive project the region had ever seen, yet it was also a sign of desperation, like trying to hold back the tide with one's hands. The wall was not just a physical barrier, it was a symbol of a state trying to defend itself against forces its bureaucracy could not understand or absorb. Meanwhile, the economy continued to wither. Tax records from Shusin's reign show decreasing revenues, even as the number of impoverished citizens seeking ration support increased. Tablets record families selling land, houses, and even selling themselves into servitude in exchange for grain rations. The bureaucracy recorded everything, each loss, each debt, each person who fell into desperation, as if the state no longer had the strength to conceal its own unraveling. By the time Ibisin, the last king of Ur-3, took the throne, the empire was entering a stage when no amount of effort could reverse its decline. Climate data shows severe soil salinization, salt rising in farmlands choking the crops. When irrigation canals were left unrepaired, fields turned white with salt and became nearly useless. This created a vicious spiral: declining harvests, declining taxes, fewer workers for canal maintenance, more soil salinization, even worse, harvests. As the economy collapsed, ancient Sumerian city-states began peeling away from central control. Larsa, Isin, and others acted like independent kingdoms once again, withholding tribute and protecting their own grain supplies. Ibisin was unable to command distant regions. The army was stretched thin, guarding borders and struggling to protect trade routes that were crumbling. And yet the final blow to Ur-3 did not come from nature alone. It was the convergence of everything at once: drought, crop failure, Amorite migration, Elamite aggression, administrative overextension, and the exhaustion of a system too heavy to sustain itself. When Elamite forces marched into the heart of Sumer, Ur, the shining capital built by Ur-Nammu and perfected under Shulgi, fell. Its temples were plundered, its treasury emptied, and Ibisin was carried off as a captive. The dynasty ended not with the roar of battle, but with the quiet collapse of an empire that no longer had the strength to stand. Yet even in the ashes of Ur-3, the Sumerians did not disappear. Their role in history simply changed. From being the center of the ancient world, they became the people who recorded their own fall, preserving it on clay tablets, so future generations would know that once a civilization led humanity through writing, law, architecture, and order, and that the very tools they created could one day weigh too heavily on a tired empire. When Ur fell to Elam and Ibisin slipped away from the stage of history, the land that had once shone with laws, temples, and a vast administrative machine suddenly felt empty, like a floodplain after the water's retreat. And in that quiet space, two city-states rose up like the last flickering pieces of Sumer's spirit, glimmering, fragile, trying to hold together a legacy that had taken millennia to build. Isin, in the southwest, became the refuge of surviving officials and royal families of III. It was not merely a rising city-state, it was the last shelter of Sumerian tradition. The early tablets from this era show that the kings of Isin continued to call themselves heirs to the kingship of clinging to the administrative system, the legal customs, and the religious rituals shaped by Namu and Shulgi. In the temple of Nana, the old ceremonies continued. The Sumerian cuneiform script remained in use. Grain rations, labor assignments, and household records were still written exactly as they had been before. It was as if the empire had not collapsed. Isin preserved Sumer by preserving its memory. But in the southeast, Larsa was rising as a rival center of power, less tied to tradition, yet stronger, sharper, more pragmatic. Supported initially by Elam but soon independent, Larsa drew merchants, soldiers, and wealth from the eastern trade routes. It had no desire to revive Sumer in its old form. Instead, it sought power by controlling water, pasture lands, and trade corridors, the very forces that had shaped Sumer's destiny since the beginning. These two cities, Isin and Larsa, stood facing one another like two paths for Sumer's future, one holding tightly to the past, the other adapting to new realities, one rooted in memory, the other rooted in opportunity. This tension turned their two-century rivalry into the most fragmented period in Sumerian history. Clay tablets from the time read like shifting sands. One year, Isin held Nippur. The next year, Larsa reclaimed it. Larsa seized then Isin tried to take it back, and failed. These were not wars of annihilation. They were like the tide, flowing back and forth, eroding authority without ever bringing true stability. And in that constant tug-of-war, power splintered into smaller and smaller pieces. The fragmentation spread through society itself. Local leaders, farming clans, and powerful families began keeping authority for themselves. The bureaucratic apparatus that once recorded every vessel of grain and every bolt of cloth could no longer stretch across the land. Workshops worked independently, storehouses withheld tribute, villages raised their own militias. All of this was written into clay, quietly, plainly, as if Sumer itself was shrinking into small pockets, each holding on to whatever fragments of heritage it could. And yet, even in this fractured landscape, something remarkable endured. Writing did not disappear, rituals did not end. Schools for scribes still filled their rooms with students. Hymns continued to be copied. Not a single corner of southern Mesopotamia abandoned cuneiform. This shows that the soul of Sumer, the soul of writing, order, law, and memory, remained intact, even when no state was strong enough to embrace it. The Sumerians seemed to understand that power could crumble, but culture must not. Through this effort to preserve what they could, Isin and Larsa became the last centers of Sumer, not centers of empire, but centers of memory. Yet while the two cities were still wrestling over fields and canals far to the north, a new power was quietly rising, broad in ambition, efficient in administration, and ready to sweep away the final surviving pieces of Sumer that Isin and Larsa struggled to protect. Amid the long struggle between Isin and Larsa, two city-states taking turns holding the last scattered fragments of Sumerian power, history quietly placed another figure at the center of the stage. He was not a king of Isin, nor a descendant of Ur's royal line, yet he became the final ruler to embody Sumerian kingship in its ancient form. His name was Rim-Sin I, king of Lhasa, who ruled for nearly 60 years, an astonishing span in an age defined by instability. And through that long reign he created an image both beautiful and melancholy, the soft glow of a sunset when a civilization rises one last time before stepping off the world stage. When Rim-Sin came to power, southern Mesopotamia was exhausted by fragmentation. Isin still tried to present itself as the heir of tradition, while Lhasa, backed by resource-rich regions to the east, was emerging as a magnet for merchants and soldiers. Rim-Sin inherited a Lhasa already growing strong, but he wanted more. He wanted to reunify the lands that had once belonged to Ur-Thrur, as the great dynasties before him had done. To do that, he chose the long path, not the path of sudden victories. His reign unfolded during a period of slow environmental recovery. Geological studies show that by this time, the soils of the southeast were gradually reclaiming fertility. Salt levels fell, slowly, painfully, while northern areas grew more arid. This shift gave Lhasa, located in a region still capable of producing crops, a natural economic advantage over Isin. Rim-Sin understood this, and he used it fully. He strengthened irrigation systems, expanded canals, boosted barley production, increased livestock herds, and revived artisan workshops, the three economic pillars that had supported Sumer since its earliest days. Under his rule, Lhasa was not merely wealthy, it was steady. And at the twilight of a fading civilization, that steadiness felt almost like comfort. Clay tablets from the period record his name with a tone of respect, sometimes even gratitude, rare for such a troubled era. They show him distributing grain during famine, adjusting taxes to ease the burden on disaster-struck regions, and ensuring that temples continued their rituals. These acts did not rebuild an empire, but they preserved its spirit, preserved what could still be saved. Within that atmosphere of calm persistence, Rim-Sin began his slow expansion. He reclaimed small towns one by one, rebuilding the fragmented map of Ur-Thrur piece by piece. And after years of tension, he achieved his greatest victory, the conquest of Isin. This was more than a military triumph. It was the moment when Lhasa became the final center of Sumerian power, unifying the old heartlands of Ur, Isin, Uruk, and Kish. But it was also the clearest sign that Sumer had entered its dusk. This unity was not the beginning of something new. It was a gathering of what remained before darkness fell. During Rim-Sin's long rule, writing continued. Scribe schools functioned, hymns were copied, rituals endured. Yet the number of tablets related to large-scale production and long-distance trade declined. The economy, though preserved, could not recover its former vitality. The state was smaller, its resources thinner, and each year new Amorite groups drifted in from the west, knocking at the gates of cities that had little left to spare. Even so, Rim-Sin held his reign like someone shielding a flame from the wind. He did not claim divinity like Shulgi. He did not craft a new legal code like Ur-Nammu. Instead, he preserved what remained of Sumer, its rituals, temples, writing, and order, like a guardian watching over a fragile treasure. And that perseverance made him the last king who was fully, recognizably, Sumerian in the ancient sense. But when the sunset burns brightest, night is already waiting at the edge. To the north, a once modest city-state was rising, quietly building a reputation for strategy, diplomacy, and legal innovation. A place few had taken seriously was preparing to reshape the entire region. That city was Babylon. And when its young king, Hammurabi, turned his eyes southward, the fate of Rim-Sin and of the last remnants of Sumer was already sealed. As Rim-Sin I, I held the last warmth of Sumer's spirit in his hands. A slow and persistent movement began to rise on the western horizon, one that would quietly reshape the rhythm of Mesopotamia. It did not arrive as a mighty army, nor as a new empire born overnight. It arrived as small bands of nomads traveling with their herds, pitching tents along riverbanks, asking for water, asking for land, and gradually staying. They spoke a Semitic tongue, they lived by herding more than farming, and they did not see themselves as conquerors. Yet it was they, the Amorites, who opened the door to an entirely new age, the age in which the name Babylon would rise. The Amorites did not come with violence, but with presence. As droughts hardened the western steppe, their grazing lands shrank, pushing them toward the fertile plains of Sumer. At first they lived on the outskirts of great cities, taking seasonal work, tending livestock for landowners, receiving rations in exchange for labor, ordinary acts that carried no hint of threat. But step by step they moved deeper into the cities. Some became mercenaries, some became traders, some earned enough to buy plots of land, build houses and gain a voice in local affairs. Their slow integration made it difficult for the Sumerians to see the transformation happening. No war announced the arrival of the Amorites, only clay tablets noting that a family from the west has joined the village, or an Amorite herdsman has been granted a field, or an Amorite has been recruited into the city guard. Scattered, quiet details, but placed together they revealed one truth. Sumerian society was no longer a single, unified world. This merging carried its own consequences. The Amorites did not dismantle Sumer's structure, they lived within it. They learned Sumerian script, worshipped Sumerian gods, worked under Sumerian law, yet gradually introduced their own ways of organizing life. Nomadic traditions made them loyal to clan leaders rather than city-states. When a leader proved capable, he quickly became the head of an Amorite community inside the city walls. And from these small circles, a new form of authority emerged, flexible, adaptive, and personal. While Rim-Sin guarded the last fragments of Sumer's legacy, Amorite leaders were quietly filling the power vacuum in the north. Regions where old cities like Kish, Mari, and Eshnunna were withering under drought, war, and shrinking trade. In these places, the Amorites were not merely residents. They were soldiers, merchants, and opportunists, stepping into roles that the weakening Sumerian system could no longer maintain. And then, in a small city no one had bothered to fear, far from the glory of and Nippur, distant from the ancient prestige of Uruk, an Amorite dynasty began to rise. They did not claim to be remaking history, they simply recognized that the moment had come. The city was Babylon, once dismissed as a roadside stop along trade routes, without a grand past, without a deep-rooted tradition like the old capitals of Sumer. Yet the Amorites possessed something the Sumerians had slowly lost in the twilight of their civilization: flexibility. They were not bound by a heavy bureaucracy, not tied to an intricate temple network, not trapped in sacred traditions they were obligated to preserve. This allowed them to wield both softness and hardness, forming alliances when needed, waging war when necessary, using trade to broaden influence, and using law to stabilize their gains. The rise of the Amorites was not a storm, it was a change of season. Sumer did not collapse abruptly, it shifted, blended, and flowed into a new current. History turned its page gently, so gently that at first glance nothing seemed extraordinary. But beneath the softness the land was transforming, and within this quiet transition a young Amorite ruler was preparing to step forward, one who would wield intellect, strategy, law, and a resolute will to mark one of the greatest turning points in Mesopotamian history. His name was Hammurabi. When the Amorites slowly began laying the foundations for a new kind of power, and the name Babylon started to glow like a young star rising over Mesopotamia, Sumer entered the moment history would later call its disappearance. But if you stand where the Tigris and Euphrates curve toward each other like two pale ribbons meeting in the late afternoon light, you'll see that this disappearance wasn't a flame being snuffed out. It was more like a mist dissolving into the air, light, slow, and impossible to mark with a single moment. As the Amorites built Babylon, as Hammurabi prepared to carve his own code of laws, as new temples rose in younger cities, many believed Sumer had stepped off the stage. But the truth was much more complex. The older layers of culture, its writing, its rituals, its sense of order and justice, seeped quietly into the new world like an underground current. They no longer carried the name Sumer, but they lived on in the way people looked at the world, in the way they thought, in the patterns the Amorites and Akkadians absorbed without realizing. The clearest trace appeared in language. Sumerian became the language of scribal schools, the same way Latin would survive in medieval Europe. Even though the Akkadians, Amorites, and Assyrians spoke Semitic tongues, they still studied, copied, and preserved Sumerian texts, from ancient hymns to geometry lessons to everyday letters. Sumerian was no longer a spoken language, but it became the language of knowledge, the place where the memory of the entire region was stored. Religion showed this continuity even more clearly. The Sumerian gods were never erased, they were simply called by different names. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea, Enlil became Elil. Yet their personalities, their roles, their stories remained unmistakably the same. When Babylonians prayed to Ishtar, they were continuing a tradition born in Uruk at the dawn of history. When ziggurats rose in Babylon, each step still held the old Sumerian idea: humanity climbing upward in search of connection with the divine. Sumerian law did not disappear when Hammurabi arrived, it deepened. His famous code drew heavily from the foundations laid by Ur-Nammu and earlier administrators. Principles of compensation, testimony, judgment, and legal procedure all carried echoes of older generations. Hammurabi expanded and sharpened them, but the belief that justice must reflect a sacred order between humans and the gods was a Sumerian inheritance running through every clause. Architecture in Babylon, and later Assyria, also followed paths Sumer had set long before. Wide city walls, square administrative districts, networks of canals running alongside streets. These were the products of generations of Sumerians who experimented, refined, and passed down their methods. Even the dream of building a tower that reached the heavens, what the world calls the Tower of Babel, was simply the extension of an old Sumerian longing to build a structure that sheltered humanity while also speaking to the unseen world above. Even in myth, Sumer left an afterglow. Gilgamesh, Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, Ziusudra. Their stories were retold throughout Semitic tradition, copied in schools, passed from one era to the next. For nearly 3,000 years, there was never a time when scribes stopped inscribing the Epic of Gilgamesh. These tales were no longer Sumerian stories, yet they kept the original shape, like the shadow of an ancient memory. The Sumerian way of thinking, their methods of classifying, recording, and calculating on clay tablets, became the backbone of Mesopotamian scholarship, then spread outward to Anatolia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those habits of mind no longer carried the name of the land that created them, but they shaped how later civilizations built societies, formed laws, and understood the world. If history is a river, Sumer did not flow in a single direction. Its waters branched out into Babylon, into Assyria, into the civilizations that followed, each carrying fragments of an older color they themselves could barely recognize. And so, when Sumer no longer stood as a state, a city, or a royal line, what remained was not existence, but imprint, traces in writing, in law, in myth, in architecture, in the very way humanity thinks about power and memory. Political borders faded, but what was once pressed into clay, under the sun, under the wind, under the hands of Sumerian people, still forms the bedrock on which this entire region stood for thousands of years. As the river of history carried Sumer deeper into the soft, dim light of memory, what remained was not territory nor thrones, but a larger question. Why do the Sumerian kings, long gone from the political stage of their own land, still stand there like the earliest milestones on humanity's path to understanding itself? Because if we trace the line from the mythic kings Alulim and Alalngar to the historically attested Enme-Barajesi, to the echoes of Gilgamesh and the great system builders like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, one truth becomes clear. The Sumerians didn't just record history, they were the first to write about power, memory, and loss with a depth the ancient world had never known. The meaning of the Sumerian kings does not lie in how many cities they built or how many battles they won. It lies in the fact that they were the first to make humanity ask, what is power? Where does it come from? How long does it last? And what remains after the one who holds it has left the earth? In Sumerian thought, power was not something that rose out of the ambitions of the strong. It was understood as a sacred flow bestowed on those who could maintain cosmic order. Kingship, therefore, never fully belonged to humans. It belonged to the order they were tasked with preserving. Even the most mythic of their rulers, like Lugalbanda or Gilgamesh, were never depicted as all-powerful gods controlling everything. They were shown as people seeking the edges of their own limits, people who understood that power did not spare them from suffering, from death, from fading away. When Gilgamesh stood before the death of Enkidu, it was not only the sorrow of a man losing his friend, it was the first moment in which humanity asked the question that every philosopher would later ask, what can I do with my own finiteness? Kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi raised another question entirely, that power is not only strength, but also the ability to create order. The Code of Ur-Nammu was the first time humanity declared that justice must not be built on revenge or emotion, but on principle. The administrative records from Shulgi's reign marked the first time society claimed that it could run on written accounts rather than the memory of any one person. These ideas seemed small at first glance, but they became the foundation of every state that followed, from Egypt to Rome. And then came the deepest paradox of all. The very moment the Sumerians built systems large enough to preserve memory, those systems became the thing that made them vulnerable to change. Books, clay tablets, bureaucracy, law. All of these required immense resources to sustain. When the climate shifted, when Amorite migrations surged, when the economy could no longer feed the administrative machine, the great city-states quietly contracted. Yet at the moment they declined, the things they created began to live on. This was the second paradox. A civilization may vanish, but its ideas do not. Sumer taught humanity that memory does not reside in the keeper of the memory, but in the way the memory is written down. If the Egyptians carved history into stone, the Sumerians pressed theirs into earth, softer, yet strangely more enduring, because once baked in fire, clay does not disappear. It cracks, but it does not dissolve. It falls, but it does not vanish. And in those tablets, the Sumerians left behind the entire method they used to understand the world: record-keeping, calculation, law, ritual, king lists, even their fears and their hopes. The disappearance of Sumer was not a failure. It was the melting of a river, splitting into smaller channels that flowed into Babylon, into Assyria, into Elam, into Anatolia, and into the civilizations that would one day read their tablets thousands of years later. Every Sumerian king, from the first mythic figures to the last rulers swept away by upheaval, left a profoundly human lesson. Power may fade, but meaning does not. Memory may dim, but traces remain. And loss touches only what is never written down. Sumer wrote everything down, and because of that they never truly disappeared. As the story of the Sumerian kings fades, as the footsteps of Gilgamesh across the desert, the hammering of Bad Tibira's metalworkers, the prayers atop the ziggurat, and the whisper of reed pens carving clay all drift deeper into the shadow of time, we find ourselves standing in a very different kind of silence. No more legends, no more victories, no more collapse. Only the damp, muted night of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates winds like a silver thread beneath the dark sky, and a thin veil of mist glides over ruins that have long forgotten the warmth of human hands. In that moment, it feels as if someone gently rests a hand on your shoulder, not to call you back, but to remind you that everything you've walked through is more than the history of a single land. It is the beginning of how humans learn to ask questions about themselves. Even as the ancient city-states slip into the old silt of time, something of Sumer still breathes softly across the ages. In the way the world writes its laws, in the first outlines of written symbols, in the measures humans use to weigh right from wrong and hold life together. Night in Mesopotamia has its own kind of spirit. Not a darkness that swallows everything, but a tender dusk, like a translucent cloth draped gently over the past. The glow of distant herders' fires, the wind sliding through mud-brick roofs, the sound of water brushing the riverbank. Together they make time feel smaller, slow enough that you can almost imagine a young scribe somewhere, lamp flickering beside him, clay tablet in hand, writing down the name of a king who lived 4,000 years ago. Under that dim light, history stops being a chain of events. It becomes a breath, steady, slow, and enduring, much like the way the Sumerians themselves saw the world, without haste, without absolutes, without demanding final answers. They simply tried to keep memory from drifting away as the river changed course. And as we close our own journey, we realize that what remains is not the power of kings, nor the height of walls, nor the length of any reign. What remains is the feeling that when we look into the dark, we know others once stood where we stand now. They too watched this river. They too asked the same questions we ask. Where do we come from? What are we meant to do here? And what will endure when we no longer stand in this place? Sumer left no perfect answers, but they planted the first questions. And humanity, for 4,000 years since, has simply been tracing the path that conversation opened. A path circling around power and its limits, around death and the longing to surpass it, around memory and the fear of being erased by time. In the night of Mesopotamia, everything seems to slow. The river still moves, the stars still hold their place. And in the quiet between them, Sumer appears not as a complete shape, but as a silent foundation lying beneath the civilizations that followed. A world that has passed, yet left echoes that cannot be separated from the story of humankind. And in that gentle boundary, Aisha, between darkness and light, between what is gone and what remains, we understand that this journey does not close with a period. It simply steps back, like the last oil lamp being set down on a table, leaving behind a small, steady glow, just enough to show that the past is still whispering, not to hold us still, but to guide us into the stories yet to come. In the final breath of the Mesopotamian night, we hear something faint. Not a summons from the past, but the calm of a civilization that has fulfilled its place in this world.